Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area, and the largest of the Great Lakes by both surface area and volume. It spans more than 30,000 square miles, and holds more water than the other four Great Lakes combined, enough to cover North and South America with 12 inches of water. Lake Superior is also vital in America's steel production, since the lake is surrounded by iron ore ranges in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But Lake Superior is also the coldest of the Great Lakes. Water temperatures in the lake average only 40 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the year. It's estimated that there are more than 5,000 shipwrecks at the bottom of Lake Superior, with around half of them undiscovered as of the release of this video. Here are 5 nearly forgotten shipwrecks on Lake Superior. In 1907, the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio began construction on a freighter labeled hull number 353 that would be named the SS Cyprus. The Cyprus was one of 8 nearly identical freighters being constructed for the Lackawanna Steamship Company based out of Cleveland. The freighter was launched on August 17, 1907. When launched, she was one of the largest freighters on the lakes. She measured 420 feet or 130 meters in length. She had a beam of 52 feet or 16 meters and had a cargo capacity of 7,500 tons. She was powered by a 1,500 horsepower triple expansion steam engine that drove a single screw. And during her brief career, the Cyprus was under the command of 48-year-old Captain Frank Hike, who had nearly 30 years of experience sailing, and to him, it seemed that the Cyprus would enjoy a long and successful career. On the morning of October 10, 1907, the Cyprus departed Superior, Wisconsin on her second voyage with a load of just over 7,000 tons of iron ore, bound for Buffalo, New York. The Cyprus enjoyed calm weather for the first 24 hours of the voyage, but then, on the morning of October 11th, a mild storm blew over Lake Superior. For the Cyprus, there was no cause for concern. Almost every ship on the lakes could handle much worse conditions. However, another vessel, the freighter Charles O. Jenkins, was also fighting her way through the storm not far from the Cyprus, when the captain of the Jenkins noticed that the Cyprus was rolling heavily in the mild seas. He thought that the crew of the Cyprus would raise a distress flag, but no distress signals were issued from the Cyprus, and the captain of the Jenkins turned his attention back to fighting his way through the storm. Soon, the storm intensified as the Cyprus made her way across Lake Superior, but still, it was nothing that the brand new freighter couldn't handle. Around noon, another vessel, the freighter George Stephenson, encountered the Cyprus, and the captain of the Stephenson noticed that the Cyprus was trailing a red wake. However, both ships were handling the storm with no problems whatsoever. But then, a few hours after the Cyprus encountered the Stephenson, the Cyprus's second mate realized that the ship was now in the midst of a full gale. He was sent to inspect the freighter's hold, where he found there was a small amount of water that entered the ship, and some of her cargo of iron ore had shifted, which caused the Cyprus to develop a slight list at port. By early evening, the storm had worsened, and waves easily crashed over the deck of the freighter, which allowed water to pour deep into her holds. The crew knew that their ship couldn't handle much more. The ship's lists to port only increased, and Captain Hike ordered his crew to head to the stern to prepare the lifeboats and don their life jackets, but he didn't issue an abandoned ship. Unfortunately, while Captain Hike did his best to keep the ship afloat, the ship had developed a 20-degree list, and her spar deck submerged beneath the surface. And soon, the Cyprus lost steam pressure, and she was rapidly sinking. Just before 8 p.m., the men in the pilot house went to prepare the raft in the ship's forward section, and soon, the Cyprus capsized on her port side, throwing everyone on deck into the monstrous waves. 4 men managed to climb aboard the raft, including second mate Charles Pitts. For the next several hours, the men paddled the raft 18 miles to the shore, and they were thrown into the water several times when the raft was flipped over by the massive waves, but made it back onto the raft. At 2 a.m., the shore was in sight, but then the raft was flipped over once again. Second mate Charles Pitts made it back onto the raft, but he realized he was alone, only a few hundred feet from the beach. He swam all the way to the beach just half a mile from the Deer Park Life-Saving Station. A life-saving surfman at the station was patrolling the beach when he came across Charles Pitts on the beach, and he was then brought to the station. He eventually recovered and returned sailing on the Great Lakes. In the end, 22 people on board lost their lives. There are a lot of theories about what caused the Cyprus to sink when she did, but the most likely explanation is that the Cyprus's hatches were not covered in tarps, which made it easier for water to enter the ship. And as the freighter George Stephenson followed the Cyprus, her captain noticed that the Cyprus was trailing a red wake, which meant that when the waves broke over her deck and poured into her hold, water was mixing with her iron ore cargo, which only got discharged by her pumps, which left the ship vulnerable to the storm. The wreck of the Cyprus was discovered in August of 2007 by members of the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society, approximately 8 miles from the shore of Deer Park, Michigan, in about 460 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Superior. Today, the story of the Cyprus is mostly forgotten, and is one of the strangest mysteries of Lake Superior. A little over a year after the loss of the Cyprus, another freighter went down on Lake Superior. The DM Clemson is the largest shipwreck in Lake Superior that remains undiscovered as of the making of this video. Labeled hull number 510, the DM Clemson was constructed in 1903 by the Superior Shipbuilding Company in Superior, Wisconsin for the Providence Steamship Company. When she was launched in July of 1903, she was one of the largest vessels on the Great Lakes. She measured 468 feet or 143 meters in length. She had a beam of 52 feet or 16 meters and came in at 5,531 gross tons. She entered service on August 14, 1903, and her short career was relatively uneventful. But then, in September of 1905, just 2 years into her career, the Clemson was caught in the middle of a massive storm on Lake Superior. During the storm, the freighter was battered by heavy winds and waves, and she lost numerous hatch covers that caused the ship to take on a huge amount of water. As a result, when she made it to Two Harbors, Minnesota 3 days behind schedule, she had a 4-foot list to port. Then, just 3 years later, on September 26, 1908, while the freighter was docking in Buffalo, New York, she ran aground. She was freed shortly afterward, but then ran aground again not long afterward. She was once again freed and continued her voyage. Then, on October 28, while she was entering the harbor of Ashtabula, Ohio, she collided with the lighthouse pier. The collision damaged 10 hull plates and one of her starboard water tanks. Fortunately, all of the damage occurred above the waterline, and temporary repairs were made until the ship could be fully repaired at the end of the season. And for the next several weeks, she continued sailing on the lakes. On the morning of November 20th, 1908, the DM Clemson, under the command of Captain Sam Chamberlain, departed Duluth with a load of 8,000 tons of iron ore bound for Ashtabula, which was the first leg of her final voyage of the season. However, only a few hours after she cleared Duluth, the Clemson found herself in the midst of a violent November gale. Massive waves swept the entire length of the ship, and water poured into her hull. On top of that, every time a wave washed over the ship, the freighter was covered in a thick layer of ice. The Clemson fought her way through the storm for the next 2 days, but fortunately, the ship held her own, and when the storm cleared, she made her way to the Sioux Locks. When the ship arrived at the Sioux, she was almost completely covered in ice, which her crew went to work clearing away. Afterward, she continued her voyage to Ashtabula, where her cargo of iron ore was unloaded. On the evening of November 27th, she went to Lorraine to pick up a load of coal for her return voyage to Duluth. However, before she took on her cargo of coal in Lorraine, Ohio, Captain Chamberlain inspected the Clemson's hull, as it was clear that her hull had been heavily strained in the storm. However, he could not find any damage in the ship's hull, and he said that she was seaworthy enough to make her final run. On November 29th, the Clemson took on her cargo of coal for her return voyage to Duluth. Loading was finished that night, and the Clemson departed Lorraine for her final voyage of the season. She arrived at the Sioux on the morning of December 1st. Another freighter was also passing through the locks not far behind the Clemson. The relatively new freighter J.J. Brown was also passing through the locks on their final voyage of the season. When both ships reached Whitefish Bay, the crew of the J.J. Brown set a course for the open lake. Since their ship was empty, it would be harder to control the ship, and the storm would push them toward the rugged shoreline. On the other hand, since the DM Clemson was stabilized with her load of coal, her crew set a course that would have the ship hug Lake Superior's shore, a decision that almost every captain would have made. Within a few hours, the crew of the J.J. Brown found themselves in the midst of a fierce storm on Lake Superior. Despite the fact that their ship was empty and riding high, monstrous waves easily crashed over the deck, which allowed water to pour into her cargo holds. Soon, the captain of the J.J. Brown ordered the engines to be shut down and allow the ship to ride with the storm for the next 12 hours. But luckily, the freighter held her own in the storm. After battling her way through the storm for the next 2 days, she made it to Duluth. When she docked, her crew waited anxiously to see if the DM Clemson survived the storm, but she never arrived. On December 2nd, the freighter Algonquin, the same ship that last saw the ill-fated Bannockburn before she vanished on Lake Superior a few years earlier, passed through a large debris field on Lake Superior. It was unclear to her crew which ship the debris was from, but it was unlikely that whatever ship it came from survived the storm. When the Algonquin reached the Sioux Locks the next day, her captain reported the sighting and was passed on to the U.S. Lifesaving Service. As the DM Clemson became seriously overdue in arriving in Duluth, it was clear that the vessel did not survive the storm. More and more debris with the name DM Clemson were found by passing ships and on the shore of Lake Superior. 5 bodies from the ship were found, but only 2 of them could be identified. One of them was the Clemson's watchman, Simon Dunn, and the other was second mate Charles Woods. The rest of her crew were never found. On December 2nd, the search was called off for the season. The wreck of the DM Clemson remains undiscovered as of the release of this video. Some theorize that the temporary repairs that were made after her collision with the Ashtabula lighthouse failed in the heavy seas. But unfortunately, without any survivors or witness testimony, the real cause of her sinking remains unknown. Then, in 1917, Just 9 years after the ship went missing, another freighter with the exact same name entered service. The new DM Clemson sailed the Great Lakes for over 6 decades until she was scrapped in 1980. The story of the original DM Clemson is all but forgotten, and until her wreck is found, the cause of her sinking will remain a mystery. Constructed in 1909 by the Detroit Shipbuilding Company in Wyandotte, Michigan for the Capital Transportation Company, the Benjamin Noble was built as a canal freighter designed to traverse the locks of the St. Lawrence River. Her design was much different from other similarly sized freighters at the time. Forward and aft deckhouses were elevated. She was designed to transport cargo such as railroad rails, stone, and coal. The vessel was launched on April 28, 1909, and she entered service later that year. She measured 239 feet, or 73 meters in length, and came in at 1,481 gross tons. She was equipped with 2 cargo booms, both forward and aft, which made it easier for her to load and unload cargo. The freighter was named after one of her owner's primary investors. The Benjamin Noble had several design flaws that would contribute to her sinking a few years later. Her spar deck was extremely low, meaning that when fully loaded, she had very little freeboard. As a result, even if the ship was sailing through a mild storm, waves would easily wash over her deck. The sides of her deck were also equipped with large scuppers that would drain any water off the ship, but it could also lead to more water flooding her deck and pour into her cargo holds if a hatch cover came loose. With all these factors in mind, the Benjamin Noble would be more prone to taking on water even in a mild storm. But still, like most lake freighters at the time, she was frequently pushed to her limits, and her short career was relatively uneventful. In April 1914, 31-year-old John Eisenhart was placed in command of the Benjamin Noble. At the time, he was the youngest captain on the Great Lakes, and the Benjamin Noble was his first command. At the same time, the U.S. economy was in recession. As a result, many freighters remained laid up well after the start of the season. But soon, the Benjamin Noble set out on her first run of the season. She arrived in Conneaut, Ohio on April 16, 1914 to take on her cargo of railroad rails from the Cambria Steel Company. For the next 6 days, the rails were loaded into the freighter, and the ship sat so deep in the water that some of her crew, including Captain Eisenhart, knew that their ship had taken on more than she could handle. But as captain, it would be difficult for him to remove any of the cargo without putting his career in jeopardy. Soon, he decided that his ship couldn't take any more cargo. There were 2 more rail cars on the pier ready to be loaded, but soon, the Noble departed Conneaut bound for Duluth, Minnesota on April 22, 1914. As she departed, someone took a photo of the ship, showing how low she sat in the water, but for the next several days, the voyage was routine. Soon, the Benjamin Noble arrived at the Sioux, but after she passed through the locks and entered Whitefish Bay, a gale warning was issued, and warning flags were hoisted at the weather signal tower at the Sioux locks. If Captain Eisenhart of the Noble had seen the warning, he would have sought shelter near the Sioux. Not long after the Noble entered Lake Superior, she was joined by another freighter, the wooden-hulled lumber freighter Norwalk. Unfortunately, not long afterward, the 2 freighters found themselves in the midst of a punishing nor'easter, which brought heavy winds and waves. Cities on Lake Superior's western shore were thrown into chaos. On top of that, the Southern Lighthouse Pier at the entrance to Duluth Harbor was knocked out in the storm. A keeper ran out to restore the light, but then a wave washed over the pier and he was swept away. Now, the Duluth Ship Canal was only marked by the lighthouse on the northern pier, which made it difficult to navigate the narrow canal without crashing into the pier. The freighter Minneapolis had just barely cleared Duluth when the storm began. She turned around, only to realize that only 1 lighthouse marked the canal, but luckily the ship made it safely back to Duluth without running aground. However, the Benjamin Noble, staying low in the water due to her heavy cargo, only made about 8 knots, and waves easily crashed over the deck. On the other hand, the Norwalk was handling the storm much better than the Noble, and soon the freighter sailed past the Noble. Both ships were still in sight one another as they plowed through the storm. When night fell, the crew of the Norwalk could see the lights of the Noble in the storm, but soon the lights disappeared. The captain of the Norwalk assumed that a squall hid the ship from view, and the Norwalk continued fighting her way through the storm. Fortunately, on the morning of April 28th, the Norwalk made it to Duluth. Her crew thought that the Noble would arrive not long after they did, but she never arrived. A few hours before the Norwalk arrived in Duluth, the Daniel J. Moreau was also fighting her way through the storm when her captain saw the lights of 2 ships in the storm, which one of them was probably the Noble, and the other was the Norwalk. But then, one of the lights disappeared. Her captain also thought that a squall must have hid the lights from view, but as the days passed, the Benjamin Noble failed to arrive in Duluth, and concern that the ship didn't survive the storm began to grow. Over the next several days, debris from the ship washed ashore on Lake Superior's western shore. None of the bodies from the ship's crew were found. The wreck of the Benjamin Noble was discovered in October of 2004 using side-scan sonar. There are many theories about what caused the Benjamin Noble to sink. The most likely is that the ship was severely overloaded, which easily allowed waves to wash over her deck and pour into her cargo holds, sending the ship to the bottom of the lake in minutes. Today, the wreck of the Benjamin Noble lies only 20 miles from Duluth in over 300 feet of water at the bottom of Lake Superior. In the early morning hours of November 6, 1918, the freighter Chester A. Congdon departed Fort William, Ontario with a load of 380,000 bushels of wheat bound for Port McNicoll, Ontario on Georgian Bay. As she set out into Lake Superior, her crew were completely unaware of what lay on the horizon. Labeled hull number 74, she was constructed in 1907 by the Chicago Shipbuilding Company in South Chicago, Illinois for the Home Steamship Company based in Cleveland. When she was launched on August 29, 1907, she was originally named the Salt Lake City, and sailed her maiden voyage on September 19th. She measured 532 feet or 162 meters in length and came in at 6,530 gross registered tons. In 1911, the Salt Lake City was sold to the Acme Transit Company based in Lorain, Ohio, which operated the ship for just under a year until she was sold to the Continental Steamship Company in early 1912, and she was renamed the Chester A. Congdon, after Minnesota Representative Chester Adgate Congdon. For the next 6 years, the Chester A. Congdon enjoyed a relatively uneventful career, with a few exceptions. On August 10, 1912, while the ship was anchored about 4 miles north of Cana Island in a heavy fog bank on Lake Michigan, she drifted into a shoal, which damaged several of her hull plates. Then, in October 1915, she ran aground on Lake St. Clair near Grosse Pointe. Afterward, the ship took on a considerable amount of water, but she was repaired and returned to service. By 1918, there was no reason to think that the Congdon's career would end anytime soon. At 2:30 a.m. on the morning of November 6, 1918, the Chester A. Congdon, under the command of Captain Charles Otterson, departed Fort William, Ontario with a load of 380,000 bushels of wheat bound for Port McNicoll, Ontario on Georgian Bay. The first couple hours of the voyage were routine, but then, just before 4 a.m., the Congdon found herself in the midst of a violent November gale. Captain Otterson diverted his ship to seek shelter closer to the shore. After the ship made it to calmer waters, she dropped anchor and sat idle for a few hours. At just past 10 a.m., the winds had calmed, and the ship continued her voyage. But then, not long afterward, a heavy fog bank descended over the freighter, and her crew reduced her speed to 9 knots. She continued sailing for another few hours, until just after 1 p.m., when in the fog, the ship suddenly came to a halt. The Congdon had run aground on the reef just north of Isle Royale. After the ship ran aground, her crew launched some of her lifeboats and made their way to Passage Island just a few miles away. The ship apparently didn't have wireless on board, or it was damaged when the ship ran aground, so her crew had no way to send a distress signal. Soon, word of the disaster made it to shore, and several vessels were sent to rescue the crew of the stranded freighter. Fortunately, all of her crew made it off the ship and made it to shore. Afterward, there were several attempts to salvage the ship, but due to the bad weather, and the ship heavily laden with her cargo of grain, these attempts were unsuccessful. A few days later, on November 9th, the Congdon, still aground on the reef, broke in two, and her stern sank beneath the surface, while the bow was still afloat. Some of her grain cargo and the crew's belongings were retrieved, before it too sank beneath the surface. Although there were no casualties, the Chester A. Congdon was declared a total loss, and she remains one of the most costly maritime disasters on the Great Lakes. Fur trapper Louis Coutu was walking near the mouth of the Agawa River on Lake Superior in December of 1928 when he noticed something floating in the icy waters. He realized it was a bottle. He picked it up and realized it had a message inside. The message read, "I am the last one left alive, freezing and starving to death on Isle Royale and Lake Superior. I just want Mom and Dad to know my fate." The message was from Alice Bettridge, who was an assistant stewardess on the ill-fated package freighter Kamloops. She was constructed in 1924 by the Furness Shipbuilding Company in Durham, England for the Canada Steamship Lines, or CSL for short. She was launched on May 20th, 1924, and entered service a few months later. She measured 250 feet, or 76 meters in length, and came in at 2,402 gross tons. She was designed to traverse the locks of the St. Lawrence River and Welland Ship Canal, and deliver cargo to ports that were inaccessible to larger freighters. She was named after the city in British Columbia. In July of 1924, the Kamloops sailed across the North Atlantic Ocean bound for Montreal. For the next 3 years, she transported general cargo all over the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River. She often sailed weeks or months after many ships on the lakes were laid up for the winter, in order to generate as much profit as possible, until one of her late-season runs brought the ship to a mysterious end. Under the command of Captain William Bryan, the Kamloops departed Port Colborne, Ontario on the morning of December 1st, 1927, with a load of salt, construction supplies, and paper-making machinery parts. The weather forecast predicted that ships on the Great Lakes would encounter rough weather. but since meteorology at the time was still in its infancy, the storm's intensity was anyone's guess. So the Kamloops continued sailing north, hoping to finish her last run of the season as quickly as possible. The weather was calm as the freighter sailed through Lake Erie and Lake Huron, but after they passed through the Sioux Locks and entered Lake Superior on December 4th, it was clear that a storm was on its way. After the Kamloops passed through the Sioux, she and several other vessels dropped anchor and decided that it was best to wait out the storm in Whitefish Bay. The Kamloops remained anchored in Whitefish Bay for the next 2 days, but the storm only intensified. Concerned that they wouldn't finish their run, the Kamloops and a few other ships nearby decided that if they wanted to complete their voyage, it was now or never. Soon the Kamloops was joined by another freighter, the Quedagh, as they steamed through the maelstrom. Both vessels plowed forward, but the storm only grew worse, and the Quedagh soon lost sight of the Kamloops in the storm. They were now sailing blind. On the night of December 6th, the captain of the Quedagh knew that they were sailing dangerously close to the rugged shoreline of Isle Royale. One of the lookouts shouted to the captain that the rocks of Isle Royale were just ahead. Realizing that they were only moments away from hitting the rocks, the captain grabbed the ship's wheel and turned hard to starboard. Narrowly, the Quedagh avoided hitting the rocks of Isle Royale. Shortly afterward, the captain looked back to see if the Kamloops was still behind them, but he could just barely make out the ship's lights in the whiteout conditions. Fearing that the Kamloops would run aground on the rocks, the Quedagh sounded her foghorn, before the Kamloops suddenly disappeared in the storm. Afterward, the captain shifted his attention back to keeping his ship and his crew safe. Unfortunately, the Quedagh survived the storm and made it to Port Arthur, Ontario. After the Kamloops failed to arrive in port on her scheduled date of arrival, there wasn't much concern about the ship. It was widely believed that the ship ran aground in the storm or found a place to ride out the storm. But soon, the Kamloops became seriously overdue, and on December 12th, a search was sent out to find any traces of the freighter. Over the next few months, debris and bodies of the ship's crew were found on Isle Royale. But then, in December of 1928, almost a full year after the ship went missing, a message in a bottle was found by fur trapper Louis Coutu in the Agawa River. The message read, "I am the last one left alive, breathing and starving to death on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. I just want Mom and Dad to know my fate." Soon, it was confirmed that the message was from Alice Bettridge, who was a 23-year-old assistant stewardess on the Kamloops. No other traces of the ship were found for nearly half a century, until the wreck of the Kamloops was discovered on August 21st, 1977. She lies on her starboard side, just northeast of Isle Royale, at the bottom of Lake Superior. There are quite a few theories about what caused the Kamloops to sink when she did, but without any survivors or witness testimony, we may never know what happened to the Kamloops and her 22 crew when their ship surrendered to Lake Superior. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss any new uploads from this channel. This video is the first of a series of videos where we cover 5 horrible shipwrecks on each of the 5 Great Lakes. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.